actual events, I would not have believed you. It really, I have an itch on my nose. It really sounds so fictional. So let's get right into it. Jan Broberg was born on July 31st in the year 1962, and she was born in Pocatello, Idaho. Jan's parents were Robert, but we're going to call him Bob, and Mary Ann Broberg. And Bob and Mary Ann ended up having two other girls after Jan had been born. In 1972, Jan was 10 years old, and another family moved into their neighborhood. All of the Brobergs became extremely close with this family, and this family consisted of Robert and Gail Birchtold and their 5 children. Eventually, both of the families grew so close that the Brobergs began to call the dad Robert Birchtold just by the name B, and that was a bit easier since there were both of the Roberts, so everyone started to just call him B, and the Broberg girls began to view B as a second fatherly figure. In the year 1974, Jan Broberg, the eldest daughter, was only 12 years old, and B had become so close to her that it was a little bit weird for those on the outside looking in. Both the Birchtolds and the Brobergs were active members of the LDS Church, and it became apparent to several members high up in the LDS Church that B was being a little inappropriate, having this relationship with Jan and also another underage girl who I assumed attended their same church. The LDS basically told B that he needed to become involved in therapy so he wouldn't have this desire to be close to any underage girls. And they kind of left it at that. At this point, B had grown so